want to insist that these sorts of experiences mean that they didn't really see anything at all with their physical or their natural eyes. And notice that this statement from David Whitmer flat out contradicts what Burnett's saying when Burnett tries to say they did not see with natural eyes, only in vision, right? Burnett sets up this dichotomy between visionary spiritual sight and natural eyes. And David Whitmer rejects that dichotomy. He says there is no dichotomy between those. It's a spiritual view, but it's also a natural view. No waffling. There's no, well, we kind of thought we saw this or that, or it was just in our mind's eye or our spiritual eye. Like, that is not their language of choice in the primary first-hand documents that has survived.
Mormonism with the Murph, where Larry Singh explores church history and the church's truth claims. Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel, Mormonism with the Murph, where Larry Singh explores the church's history and the church's truth claims, and I'm very excited for today's episode. We're going to be doing an episode responding to some of the criticisms made against the 3 and the 8 witnesses of the gold plates, and I have with me scholars and apologists Neal Rappleye and Stephen Smoot. Guys, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having us.
Glad to be back.
Yeah.
I'm glad. I'm surprised you let me come back here after what I did last time. I thought for sure you would have banned me from your channel.
Oh, well, it was over a year ban, but the ban is up and now you're back.
It's been lifted. There you go. Good.
And yeah, I've had you both on previously. You and me, Stephen, we spoke about evidence for the Book of Mormon. We did an episode on that, and we talked about also some of the criticisms and naturalistic explanations going against the Book of Mormon and your responses to that. And we did a similar episode, Neal. We spent about a good 3 hours talking about evidences for the Book of Mormon. And then we did a part 2 looking at the gold plates and comparing to other plates in the ancient world and sort of like defending the gold plates as well, criticisms about that. And you guys are both 2 great researchers and apologists defending the faith, the Book of Mormon, and other topics. But today we're going to be focusing on the witnesses of the gold plates. And this is quite a hot topic at the minute. I think there's been a lot of content sort of on YouTube that's been put out on the witnesses. You've had a couple of episodes by like the Mormon Stories LDS discussion series going after the 3 witnesses, the 8 witnesses. You've had your Book of Mormon Central, A Marvelous Work and a Wonder episode on the witnesses. And then you had the guys, Bill Reel, RFM, Dan Vogel do a response to that. And I've done a couple of videos recently. So the witnesses seem to be a hot topic. And this is also around the time of year when they have their experience. So this is quite a good time, I think, to address this.
Yeah, absolutely.
So why don't we begin?
Did they respond to Book of Mormon Central's most recent video, their episode 5 of A Marvelous Work and Wonder, or was that maybe a previous thing? I'm just sort of curious because that just came out like a week ago, right?
Yeah, I think they've been responding to every single one. I don't think I've watched every single one.
Oh, Neal, you've got some obsessive hate watchers. Well done. Well done, Scripture Central. Woohoo. They
did a 2-parter response with Dan Vogel to the witnesses, which I listened to, and where I do agree with them was their criticisms of the acting in that last episode. Obviously, Neal, you don't have to comment on that, but I do agree.
It'd be fun to see Bill Reel try to act in something, right? I'd pay money to see that.
Okay,
I'm sure he'd do a better job.
Let's keep it kind. Let's keep it kind here. So why don't we begin with, well, for my listeners should know who you are, but maybe briefly, just give me the 1-minute introduction, your background, who you are, and what is it that you both do. Will we start with you, Neal?
Sure. Yeah, so I'm Neal Rappleye. I am the director of research here at Scripture Central, which entails just kind of coordinating all the different things that our researchers are working on, just coordinating all those projects. And also my main responsibility has to do with the No-Whys. I directly oversee the production, the review, and the publication of the No-Whys. I write several of them, along with kind of overseeing the others being written by other researchers and things like that. So,
are they still going, by the way? Because I know you have hundreds of them, and they're like a minute, 2 minutes.
Yeah,
long, usually.
Yeah, they're like we've got. Let's see, how many do we have now? I can actually check it in like just 30 seconds here.
Maybe 30 seconds. I thought you should have known it right offhand, Neal. Come on. What are they paying you for over there at Scripture Central?
Come on, Stephen. You know they don't pay us anything. We've had 137 have come out so far, or 737, excuse me. Yeah, like we're almost like a Boeing jet, right? A Boeing 747. That's almost how many no-whys we've got. So yeah, we just keep plugging away with them. Some of them deal with apologetic topics. Others are just kind of interesting stuff that we think helps give you some insight and context into the scriptures. And that's what we're trying to do, is we're trying to make a lot of this more accessible to people. So, you know, people who won't read a long article written by the great Stephen Smoot will hopefully read a summary of that article on our website. So that's kind of what we're aiming for with those. So
awesome. Stephen, introduce yourself to my audience and who aren't familiar with you.
Well, as Neal said it best, I am the great Stephen Smoot.
That's what we'll refer to this whole interview, the great.
Yes, indeed. No, so I'm Neal's very good friend. I've known Neal for, well over 10 years now, it seems like, right, Neal?
Yeah, I mean,
we've
it's
sort of
13, I think, 13 or 14.
Yeah, something like that. So
because you both worked together at Book of Mormon Central for a time.
I worked with Neal at Book of Mormon Central. That's right. Even before then, Neal and I had written stuff together for the Interpreter Journal. We were sort of thick as thieves back in the day, cutting our teeth on old Interpreter articles and stuff like that. I am currently not working at Book of Mormon Central, but rather I am working at two places right now. The first, I work at the B.H. Roberts Foundation, which is headed by Josh Coates. It's an initiative that was started, I think, about 4 years ago is when it kind of got off the launch pad, and when I was hired to come on to be a research associate at the B.H. Roberts Foundation. And in that capacity, kind of like what Neal does, I research a variety of topics related to early Latter-day Saint history, scripture, culture, things like that, and write short, accessible articles for individuals online to access. I've done lots of archival work for the B.H. Roberts Foundation, where I've poured through documentary sources and assembled them for the website that we have there to make those sources available. In fact, you'll see some examples of what I mean later in the podcast. So I'm working at the B.H. Roberts Foundation. I'm also an adjunct instructor at Brigham Young University in religious education, where I teach ancient scripture. And so I like to say I teach all the old stuff at BYU, right? So Bible, Book of Mormon, Pearl of Great Price, all that good stuff. In fact, I'm teaching this the summer term, which is a lot of fun and also kind of crazy to teach. I'm teaching the second half of the Book of Mormon in like 8 weeks or something. So, you know,
Wow.
it's kind of wild. Besides that, I'm a doctoral candidate at the Catholic University of America in Semitic and Egyptian languages and literature. So my academic training is in ancient Near Eastern studies and ancient languages, specifically the biblical languages. And I also have a background in Egyptology. And I've created this sort of hybrid focus or emphasis where I look at the interaction between Egypt and the Bible in the ancient world, or the biblical world and ancient Egypt. And that's also what my dissertation topic is on. So I have 1 foot in sort of Latter-day Saint writing and publishing and research, 1 foot in ancient Near Eastern studies, 1 foot in Egyptology, and somehow it just kind of works out. And I think I've still maintained my sanity through all of it, but Neal could probably say something to that, perhaps.
Well, I think Stephen just confessed to having 3 feet, which I think raises questions about his humanity.
Indeed, yeah.
You know,
that's the only way you can do
it. We should probably have him investigated for being an alien from another planet.
Take me to Area 51 to Roswell and dissect me or something.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
You sound like the next Hugh Nibley, and you've done a lot of work on the Book of Abraham as well, which I'll be excited to have a conversation with you when I get onto that topic as well.
Hopefully sometime we'll be able to do that. Yeah, Book of Abraham is sort of one of the little wheelhouses I work in because of it. That's sort of where all these things sort of collide, right? Latter-day Saint history, ancient Egypt, the biblical world, the world of Abraham, all that sort of comes together in the Book of Abraham. So that's a very fertile ground for some of my academic interests.
Very good. And B.H. Roberts Foundation, you have a website. It's mormonr.org.
Yeah, so Mormon R, the letter R, so MORMONR.org, mormonr.org, or also bhrobertsfoundation.org. You can check out either of those. Mormoner is also all on social media, like Book of Mormon Central or Scripture Central, right? So Facebook, Instagram, you can check us out there as well.
Awesome. Okay, so the plan is for this episode is we're going to be discussing and responding to some of the criticisms made against the three witnesses of the gold plates, Oliver Cowdery, David Whitmer, Martin Harris, and their claims of seeing the angel and the plates and hearing the voice of God. And we'll be addressing, I think, some specific statements like Stephen Burnett, Anthony Metcalfe, John Clark, John Murphy, and maybe some others as well, claiming that, you know, they saw them with either spiritual eyes or the eye of faith, or maybe that it was some sort of a hallucination. And then we'll also be addressing the 8 witnesses. Did they really see and handle the plates? And doing sort of a deep dive into Stephen Burnett's statements and maybe touching on others. You know, did they see the plates covered in a cloth? Was it some sort of a supernatural seeing, not a literal seeing as well? And then we'll do some rapid fire questions at the end. But maybe you could tell me what was sort of like the motivation or the context for you guys writing an article or defending the 3 and the 8 witnesses, because there's been a lot of work done on this topic by like Richard Lloyd Anderson wrote the great book Investigating Book of Mormon Witnesses. There's been other good articles. Why did you guys feel the motivation to want to do the article?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I think the way it really started is I was doing some research on Martin Harris specifically, and I gave a presentation. Was it last year at Fair or the year before? I can't even remember now.
I think it was last year because it was for Dan Peterson's Festschrift, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Year.
So
yeah.
I wrote a paper for Dan Peterson's Festschrift on Martin Harris and the whole spiritual eyes thing. And so I was doing research related to that. And in doing that, obviously I was looking at the Stephen Burnett letter. And I was looking at how the Stephen Burnett letter had been used and handled in both, by both Latter-day Saint scholars and also critics like Dan Vogel and so forth. And I read some things that Dan Vogel said about the Burnett letter that, in my opinion, were just completely indefensible. He made a statement, and I think Stephen will go over it, I suspect, when we get to his portion of all this, but he kind of made a statement that, like, none of the 8 witnesses ever contradicted what Burnett said. And that, just off the top of my head, I was like, well, that's just not true. Like, we know that there are a bunch of examples. And so I kind of got fired up about maybe writing something that illustrated how all of those, how that's not true, how, basically what are Burnett's claims and then what do the 8 witnesses actually say, and illustrating how they do, in fact, contradict him on literally everything he says and the implications of what he says and everything. And I was kind of fired up about it and talking to some friends about it, including Stephen here. And but I wasn't gonna write anything because I was like, I don't really have time. I'm super busy and things like that. So Stephen was like, well, what if I help you? Then could we do something about it? And then we decided that yeah, let's go ahead, let's do it, let's write something. So that's kind of the origins of it right there, more or less. So
there's another aspect to it, Neal. It dovetailed very nicely. Like, all the stars kind of aligned to make this article happen, because at the same time that Neal was doing his Martin Harris research, Josh Coates had sort of given me sort of a research assignment or task at Mormoner, which was to do a Q&A article on the witnesses, right?
Okay.
And sometimes we can kind of pick which subjects we want to research for Josh. Other times he says, hey, could you tackle this? And he asked me, could you tackle the witnesses? I said, yeah, sure, right? And like I mentioned before, one of the things that we do at Mormoner is we have these big databases of primary sources that we link to with our articles, right? Because we want to cite stuff, but make the primary source data available for everybody to analyze for themselves. And so Josh had me like pour through the archives, both digital archives and like literally like the church history library and other archives, to get scans and upload scans of these sources to our database. And that includes, and I'll show some examples later during my discussion, but that includes like bibliographic entries, metadata, all the, transcriptions of the sources, all that stuff. So I like had all this stuff for Neal and I to use. Like, I had already kind of done all that legwork of like hey, here's all the primary sources right here. So it's kind of just like sort of plugging them into the article that we're writing, because they're like easily accessible, including, right, I did my own transcriptions of these things. So like it's searchable, easy to find, easy to plug in. So it really was very serendipitous, the fact that we are both doing this work on the witnesses independent of each other. And then when we decided, let's write an article about it, it was like, well, hey, we've already got all the sources assembled more or less. And so it shouldn't be too hard to sort of throw them together, right? And to make them accessible and make them citable. So that's the other sort of aspect of the genesis of the paper that we have that's coming out here pretty soon.
Very good. And what's the name of the article going to be, and where can people find it? I'll put a link in as well. Has it been published yet?
It has not, and I think in Stephen's slides, he'll actually cover that again. But we can just say it's Stephen Burnett versus the 8 Witnesses: An Exercise in Mature Historical Thinking, and it'll appear in the Religious Educator journal coming out from RSC. It should be in their very next issue, as far as we understand. That's what we were last told. So it's been peer reviewed. It went through peer reviewing and everything, and it's been approved for publication. And so and it's like, at least in the Word document, it's like 45 pages long. So
Wow.
it's pretty, like, it spares no details.
And 121 footnotes, 45 pages and 121 footnotes.
So we spared no details in elaborating all the evidence here as thoroughly as we could. And so, yeah, and it'll be available probably within the next couple months, I would guess, because, yeah, we were last told it would be in this next issue that's coming out. So,
well, very good. And obviously you won't be able to go through as much detail as you've covered in the article, but I think this will be a really good summary of the highlights and the takeaways, and people can go read it to dive in deeper. So maybe we could begin with, before we get into maybe the specific quotes about, spiritualize some of the criticisms going against the 3 witnesses, is there anything that either of you would like to say, sort of like an opening about the testimony of the 3 witnesses, maybe about the number of statements they given, or the majority of their primary, secondary statements? What do they claim about their experience, the consistency of their testimonies? Do they ever deny it? What do you want to say about the 3 witnesses to begin?
well, that's a great question. I suppose to start things off, it makes the most sense to just, like, we sometimes, when we have these discussions, we assume people listening know who the 3 witnesses are, know what their experience was, and know what they said about it, right? And so I think it helps to start off by just reminding people this is what happened, or at least what they said happened, and this is the context. So remember, the 3 witnesses are Martin Harris, Oliver Cowdery, David Whitmer. The basics of the story are that Joseph is at the Whitmer home, and he's translating the Book of Mormon. He's translating what we now know as 2 Nephi 27, most likely. And as he's translating that, David Whitmer's in the room. Oliver Cowdery is his scribe. In fact, I can't remember if we have the original manuscript for 2 Nephi 27 or not, but we have everything else we have in the original manuscript for 2 Nephi is in Oliver's handwriting. And so the material before and after is in Oliver's handwriting. So Oliver's probably the scribe at this time. David Whitmer's apparently in the room. And according to Joseph Smith's history in 1839 or 1838, or whenever he dictated this to his scribes, Martin Harris had come down for a visit and was present as well. And they come across this passage in what we now know as 2 Nephi 27, where it says that there would be 3 witnesses. And Joseph Smith says that, like, they basically started begging him. Those 3 specifically started begging him to be the witnesses. And it was a few days later, Joseph Smith had prayed about it. He comes to them and says, yeah, okay, the Lord has said that you guys can be the witnesses. So they go out, and I think you already mentioned early on, it was actually about this time of year, late June, 1829. They go out into the woods, or a clearing in the woods, out by the Whitmer farm. and the three of them or the four of them pray, and at first they don't have anything happen. And Martin Harris says, "Oh, it's because of me. I don't have enough faith." And so Martin leaves, and then David and Oliver and Joseph have this vision where, and I'll just read straight from Joseph's account here. He says, "Behold, an angel stood before us. In his hands he held the plates which we had been praying for these to have a view of. He turned over the leaves one by one so that we could see them and discern the engravings thereon distinctly." And so he describes all of this, right? He says that they hear the voice of the Almighty, like these plates have been revealed by the power of God, and they have been translated by the power of God, so on. And so it's a visual experience. It's an audio visual experience, you could say.
We don't often
right?
focus on that part, that they hear the voice of God as well, declaring the work to be true, and the translation as well, which is pretty powerful element of their visceral experience and testimony as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And then Joseph, after that vision closes, Joseph leaves to find Martin, and he finds Martin praying on his own, right? Trying to like feel like he's right with God or whatever it was that he needed to sort out. And then so Joseph kneels down and he prays with Martin. He joins him, and then Joseph says the same vision opens up, and so Martin sees all of the same things, and he exclaims, "'Tis enough, 'tis enough. Mine eyes have beheld, mine eyes have beheld." And that's the account, that's the official account in Joseph Smith's history about what happened, right? And then they all go back. Lucy Mack Smith actually gives us details about, like, they all go back to the Whitmer home, and people in the people who are there, the Smith family, the Whitmer family, they hear these testimonies, and they hear these accounts from them right away, right? Like right after it happened. So they're kind of second witnesses, if you will, in that, like, they're able to attest, like, no, they didn't just like make this up later. Like, we were there, and they came back from the woods and they were like, hey, yeah, no, we saw this. This is what we saw. So then we don't have exact documentation on exactly when the official testimony of the three witnesses is drafted and written and signed, but we know it has to be before the manuscript goes to the printer, right? And so it's generally assumed that this is something that was written around the same time, summer 1829, basically. And I think that we really should underscore here, it doesn't get its due as a historical document, in my opinion. This is, people want to go and read all the other statements about what happened, right? This is the earliest, indisputably, this is the earliest statement we have. It is firsthand. It is signed by 3 of the 4 participants in the experience. And people who want to dispute, like, oh, but Martin was separated from them, and so they aren't actually a mutual experience or whatever. No, these 3 people, they sat down and they said, what did we experience? And they talked about it, and they agreed that the language in this statement reflected what all 3 of them saw and experienced, right? And so this is an early statement. All 3 of them are agreeing to it and having their name signed to it, affixed to it. I know that some people make a fuss about it only being in Oliver Cowdery's handwriting, because we only have the printer manuscript copy, right? We don't have the original. And so they're like, oh, but all the signatures are in Oliver Cowdery's handwriting. Okay. Well, all of them had ample opportunity to deny the details of this statement if they wanted to in their life, and of course they did not, right? And in fact, we can maybe get into some examples later, but all of them said things that more or less confirm the details of these statements, right? So
of course. I think I remember as well, because I did a response a month or 2 ago to the Mormon Stories episode, and they brought up that criticism that Oliver signed the statements. And I can't remember the specific source, but I got this from Fair. But I know David Whitmer was interviewed by somebody asking about, did he sign his name to the testimony of the 3 witnesses, and he says he did, but then he said, oh, well, why is it all in Oliver's handwriting? And he said, oh, well, he must have copied it. So it seems like he
I'm glad
he
Neal
did to
brought
the
that up.
original.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because I was going to mention it in my slide because I have it right there, at least for the 8 witnesses. It's the same thing. It's in Oliver Cowdery's handwriting. This is such a frivolous accusation.
Yeah,
The explanation for that is this is our earliest manuscript copy of the statement.
yeah,
And Oliver
Right.
Cowdery is the one who drafted that manuscript. And so, of course, it's in his own handwriting. That's textbook grasping at straws to try to find some problem with this, is to say it's not their own handwritings. Well, yes, that's true, but there's a reason for that. And as Neal pointed out, they had, well, not only do some of them, John Whitmer and Samuel Smith reportedly also say the same, that they did not hesitate to sign the witness to the statement themselves. So besides the fact we have vindication that they themselves signed it, and that original holograph is now missing, we have plenty of instances where they could have said, no, I don't agree with what that says, or I'm recanting that, or Oliver made it up and I didn't agree to it, but they never do that. So right out of the way, hopefully we can get this, just brush it out of the side. It's a frivolous accusation to raise on this point.
And look,
definitely not.
it's the most serious skeptics and critics who don't believe in the Book of Mormon and things like that, who have tried to take this evidence seriously. None of them take seriously the idea that the other witnesses didn't affirm the statement and didn't sign it, right? Dan Vogel accepts the David Whitmer testimony that you mentioned already, and I believe it was Orson Pratt and Joseph F. Smith who were interviewing him, and yeah, he's like, oh yeah, no, we all signed it. So it's, it's again, it's such a frivolous point. And so I think these official statements of both the 3 and the 8 witnesses, they don't always get their due. These are documents that deserve to be taken very seriously in any other historical setting or context, on any other historical event. To have like an affidavit-like statement from multiple witnesses saying, this is what happened, this is what we saw, this is what we witnessed, and to have it from so early after the event, multiple eyewitnesses, this would carry a lot of weight in any other historical discussion, and so it deserves to be kind of front and center, pride in place. Every other statement that's made after it, right, is to some extent needs to be understood in light of this more in a lot of ways this is the most complete statement, right? But anyway, what I think is
Can
also
I just add something to that real quick, Neal?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I had a few weeks ago the opportunity to meet with a group of evangelical Christian students from across different parts of the country. They gathered at BYU. They were involved with a group called Ratio Christi, which is this sort of interfaith, Christian apologetics and interfaith sort of dialogue group or apologetics group. They have like a chapter, I think, at UVU, Utah Valley University in Orem, and they also sometimes show up at BYU to do conversations. I was with them a few weeks ago, and one of the students asked me, he said, as a believing Latter-day Saint, what's some of the strongest evidence you think is for the Book of Mormon? And I first said, well, we have these witnesses. And the reason I said that is because I know for a fact that evangelical apologists and other Christian scholars make a big deal about the witnesses for the resurrection of Jesus in the New Testament, right?
Yeah.
Now now look, I'm a Christian. I believe in the resurrection of Jesus and in his divinity, and I think that those statements from the apostles and others in the New Testament are also credible, powerful statements of witnesses, right? But like, let's stack up our New Testament witnesses for the resurrection and our witnesses for the Book of Mormon. Like, could you imagine what New Testament scholars, whether they're believers or not, could you imagine what they would give to have firsthand statements from, like, Peter and these guys and the apostles, not stuff from decades later attributed to them, like with the Petrine epistles or whatever, right? That's or of questionable authorship. I mean, like indisputable, firsthand, contemporary statements from the apostles attesting to seeing the resurrected Jesus, right?
And in their own handwriting, even, right?
In their own handwriting, and it's exactly right.
If there was a statement like this from the apostles that was just like, it was in the handwriting of, like, let's just say Matthew, right? Like it was in the handwriting of one of the apostles, and it signed all 12 of their names to the experience, right? you would have no one splitting hairs being like, oh, but it's only in Matthew's handwriting. Like, be like, no, this is
No.
incredible,
Yeah.
incredible.
It would
evidence.
revolutionize our understanding of the New Testament, and
Absolutely.
and debates around the historicity of the resurrection of Jesus would be fundamentally changed if this document were to come to light, and there was no question about its authenticity or its provenance, right? And so
Yeah.
I totally agree with Neal that in other historical circumstances, these sorts of statements would take pride of place, but they don't for a lot of people with the Book of Mormon. I think the answer is obvious. Why not? But there's a clear double standard, at least, in the way that many people treat the witnesses to the Book of Mormon, and especially the 8 witnesses, which I'll touch on in a little bit, versus other historical incidences or other historical accounts.
Well,
I would like to acknowledge my friend and fellow podcaster, Stephen Pinecker. He's the host of Mormon Book Reviews, and I appreciate his fairness towards Mormonism. And he is probably one of the few Christians who he actually acknowledges that there's more evidence for the credibility of the witnesses of the gold plates than there is for Jesus's resurrection. But yeah, often Christians can be very dismissive of their testimony of seeing the angel in the plates. And for somebody who believes in God, believes, that angels can come and visit people, I feel like you can't just dismiss their testimonies out of hand. And what you were saying, Neal, as well, that, and not to steal any thunder, but throughout their lives, not only did they never deny their testimonies, but there's so many statements of them reaffirming even after leaving the church to their deathbeds. I did a recent video, about 45 minutes. I didn't find all the statements that Richard Lloyd Anderson says there is, but I found about 10 from Oliver Cowdery, 15 from Martin Harris, and about 40 from David Whitmer, where in a very almost like repetitive, tedious way, they just reaffirm over and over in a very emphatic, adamant, and quite consistent way that just aligning with their official testimony that they know they saw the angel in the plates and it was real to them, which I think is quite powerful.
Yeah, well, and for what it's worth, I've done the most research on Martin Harris over David Whitmer or Oliver Cowdery, and I've gathered about 150 documents
in total for the 3, or just for Martin?
In total, just for Martin.
Wow.
That are, not all of them are him specifically saying, like, I saw the angel, but he's saying, he's testifying of the Book of Mormon. He's identifying himself as a believer. Things like that, where, the implication, if there's a statement printed in a book that says, I saw an angel, and then I tell you, yeah, I believe that book, well, the implication is I'm still standing by that statement that I saw the angel too, right? And so if you, the totality of evidence over Martin Harris's life, I've added up about 150 documents that have some pertinence to his views about his testimony at the time. And I haven't sifted through all 150 to tell you. I mean, sometimes people want to know exactly how many of them specifically mention the angel or specifically mention the plates or whatever, but it's in the dozens for sure on Martin Harris. And there's a whole book edited by Lyndon Cook on the interviews with David Whitmer that has at least 70 or 80. Do you know how many are in there in that book off the top of your head, Stephen?
This is Larry Morris's book?
No, the Lyndon Cook book on
Lyndon Cook. I mean, I have it behind me. I can go look and check it out if we want.
I mean, maybe it's closer to 60, maybe 70 and 80's high, but it's, there's a lot of statements from those two specifically because they lived so long, right? And a lot of people took the opportunity to talk to them. I've tried to gather up whatever I can on Oliver Cowdery. You're going to have a hard time finding everything Richard Lloyd Anderson talked about with Oliver Cowdery, because he talked about sources that I think he's the only one who ever laid eyes on him. And he had a big, giant documentary history on Oliver Cowdery that he and Stephen Fallring were working on. And now both, not Stephen Fallring, what's his name? Scott Fallring. Yeah. They were working on a big, like 4-volume documentary history on Oliver Cowdery that was going to publish all these documents and stuff. And then, they both ended up passing away, unfortunately, before they were able to do that. But the evidence for all of them really is pretty extensive that they continue to affirm. But something I want to note, and I know we're probably taking more time on this kind of preliminary stuff than you were hoping to. So, but the official statement itself, some of the language there, I think gets overlooked sometimes because the whole document tends to get overlooked. And so people don't go back and read this before they freak out about spiritual eyes or whatever, right? So the testimony of the three witnesses opens, be it known unto all nations, kindreds, tongues, and people, and unto whom all this work shall come, that we, through the grace of God the Father and our Lord Jesus Christ, have seen the plates which contain this record. So right out of the gate, they're acknowledging that there was some sort of divine power involved in what they experienced. Like, this has never been hidden or covered up or whatever, right? They understood their experience involved. It was only through the grace of God, right, that they were able to have this experience. But what does that mean about the nature of what they saw? They go on a little later, and we also testify that we have seen the engravings which are upon the plates. And we already talked about the Joseph Smith account, where he says they were able to see the engravings distinctly. I've done some research on the plates and their makeup and the engravings, and they were probably pretty small. So this tells us something about how close they are. They aren't like, standing several feet away from an angel or whatever, and he's just showing them this gold object that they can barely make out. They're up close. They're looking at the plates. They're seeing the leaves turned over. They can see the engravings clearly. But they continue. So they could see the engravings which are upon the plates, and they have been shown unto us by the power of God and not of man. And we declare with words of soberness that an angel of God came down from heaven, that he brought and laid before our eyes. They say our eyes, right? That we beheld and saw the plates and the engravings thereon. And we know that it is by the grace of God the Father and our Lord Jesus Christ that we beheld and bear record that these things are true. And it is marvelous in our eyes. So, and it goes on. I skipped over the parts where they talk about the voice of God and stuff. But like I said, it's both a visual and an oral experience for them. And they're very clear, right? That on the one hand, there's the grace of God and the power of God that's involved in making this vision possible. It is a spiritual experience.
Right.
But they are seeing with their eyes, right? They are seeing with their eyes. That is what they all sign their name to within months, right? Possibly within days, within a few weeks, probably, right? Of the experience. And that, again, that lays the foundation. We don't get new sources on the witnesses terribly often, but about, I don't know, how long ago is it? Like maybe 10 years ago or something like that. There was this new source that was discovered, a letter from Oliver Cowdery to Cornelius Blatchley. November 9th, 1829. Okay, this letter was written November 9th, 1829. This is
a few months after the fact.
This is a few months. This is just a few months after. Some context to this letter is Cornelius Blatchley had heard these stories, and so he wrote a letter, and he did not address Oliver Cowdery in the letter. He addressed Joseph Smith, David Whitmer, and Martin Harris. And in the letter, he's basically saying, like, he says, you guys claim to have seen this record by miraculous power and by supernatural power and stuff. Tell me, did you really see it or whatever, right? We don't have his original record. We don't have his original letter, but we have him in the newspaper, like, talking about what he said and what he sent to them. So we have that context from him.
Right.
And David Whitmer, Martin Harris, Oliver, Joseph Smith don't write back. Oliver does. And Oliver says that Messrs. Harris and others asked him to write on their behalf. So again, I want to speak to the fact that they all feel like, Martin Harris included, who had the experience separately, that one of them can just speak for all of them. They feel like their experience is similar enough, consistent enough. They have an understanding one with another, that they're all capable of describing what they all experienced, right? But he basically says, and so he writes Blatchley, and he says, you wanted to know about seeing the book. And he writes, it was a clear, open, beautiful day, far from any inhabitants, in a remote field, at the time that we saw the record, of which has been spoken, brought and laid before us by an angel, arrayed in glorious light, ascended out of the midst of heaven. All right. This is as straightforward a statement as you could ask for, right? We were just out on our own, and broad daylight, clear, open, beautiful day. There's nothing. It's not like, it's not like hazy. It's not
Not
like,
hocus pocus in the middle of
there's no like,
twilight and the witching
yeah,
hour type thing.
it's,
Yeah.
And
it's
doesn't
clear,
he say, is
open.
it this quote or another? Like, if this is human juggling, which is kind of
Yeah,
like
and
trickery
yeah,
or
so he
judgy.
concludes that because that's juggling is this funny term that they used back then, you know, not just talk about like juggling balls, but to talk about, you know, deception. If this is trickery, basically, I would say shenanigans. I don't know if anybody says shenanigans anymore,
That's
but
a good word.
you know, this is like basically Blatchley was like, I call shenanigans on this, and Oliver's like, this is what happened, and you know, if you think it's shenanigans, if you think it's juggling, trickery, you know, decide for yourself. And it's, you know, what more do you want a person to do, right? All Oliver can do is say, this is what happened, and he knows people are going to believe it or not. There's nothing else like, but straightforward testimony. And again, this is look. It's well, I shouldn't say it that way. That's not appropriate. But it is like every exmo in the world wants to discover like a new source that's super early and will like totally undermine the basic narrative of our faith. And so if this early letter from Oliver Cowdery had come out and had been like even a little bit like waffly or whatever, had given them any grounds to be like, aha, it's deception and trickery, they'd be all over this. But here, like, you couldn't have asked for a better source to be discovered that's early, firsthand, and it's a straightforward a statement about what happened as you could possibly ask for.
Yeah, very emphatic, very adamant, very matter of fact.
Yeah.
Just one quick thought I had. I remember a criticism being made in, I think it was one of the Mormon Stories episodes, which I didn't really understand. They're making the argument of like, why was the power of God involved, or like this brilliant light, or like why was it some visionary experience? Why wasn't it just, you know, the angel just came and showed them the plate? It's like just a very natural visitation, like talking about like the power of God or vision makes it seem like, well, they just imagine this. But as I was thinking about it, like, I would almost find it more strange if it was prophesied and claimed that they'll have this really miraculous visitation of an angel, and then it was just like, you know, he just looked like a normal dude in the woods showing them these plates. Like, was this Sidney Rigdon or
Who would
something?
believe that that's an angel? Who would believe
Yeah,
that's divine, right?
Right.
yeah. And then
I,
also
for one,
hearing
would
the
like
voice
to
of
know the
God.
minute. I was just going to say, I would like to know the minute details of the metaphysics of angel visitations and when or when not they give off glory and what that glory looks like. I mean, like, come on, right? Yeah, the sort of hair splitting over these sorts of things. Like, if you believe angels are real and can show up to people and show them gold plates, then the idea of like, well, it was a little too miraculous. It was a little too extraordinary of an angelic visit. Like, come on, that's sorry, I didn't mean to
Yeah,
interrupt you though, Murph.
and well,
No,
and I
fine.
want to say, if that's what they want, read the Mary Whitmer accounts.
Yeah.
Because that's what happens. Mary Whitmer's out milking cows, and a guy just comes up to her. She doesn't say he's glows or the power of God. There's nothing like that. A guy just comes up to her, shows her the plates. The only like sort of miraculous thing about it is like she talks about how like she looks up and he's gone, and he just kind of vanishes on her. But everything else about it, like if it didn't have that part, there would be absolutely nothing like supernatural in the accounts about Mary Whitmer's experience.
Right.
So, you know,
What's more, Neal, I would add that to kind of show what sort of again, another frivolous accusation that is and kind of how bad faith it is, let's assume an alternate universe where that is what happened with the three witnesses, that like a man just showed up and showed them an object and then went away. I can guarantee you that the accusation would be, oh, well, that could have been anybody, right? That
Yeah.
could have just been any Confederate of Joseph Smith's or his friend or his buddy that just showed up with some
absolutely.
object he made up.
Yeah.
So like
I would have found
that
less
wouldn't
credible.
satisfy them if it was the other way as well.
And
It's yeah.
And I think, and this we'll get into this probably more when Stephen gets his chance to have his say on the eight witnesses stuff. But I think because I believe the eight witnesses evidence is so compelling that there's no disputing Joseph has in his physical possession an actual record, or at least a passably ancient look. Like if it's a forgery, it's a pretty good one, and it's one he has no qualms about showing to his friends. I would contend that the angel is a much bigger problem for the unbeliever here, because Joseph doesn't need it, right? The revelation, DNC 17, doesn't promise that they'll see an angel, right? DNC 5 never promises that that the witnesses will see an angel. Nothing. Second Nephi 27, Ether 5. None of these references promise an angelic visit as part of the plates. Okay, and so if Joseph Smith is a con man and he has a believably ancient looking set of plates that he later shows to other witnesses, why does he complicate this by like involving an angel all of the sudden? Like what's even the point of that? So I think the angel's a far bigger problem if you don't believe than if you do, right? But I'm gonna call shenanigans here, because I think, like Stephen said, if the evidence was different and was exactly what they say they want, they'd have just a completely different excuse. We have the account of Mary Whitmer that is exactly what they want, or what they're saying they want here, more or less. And I'm sure they'll find some nitpick thing about that, after we call them out on it. It's, in fact, one of the things I've pointed out before, I don't know if I've done it publicly I certainly haven't in print, but everything critics say they want for the first vision, early first-hand accounts, where's the documentation before 1832 kind of stuff, that they want, why didn't Joseph Smith write it down in his journal, like right after he came in? Like everything they say they want for the first vision, we have for the witnesses. We have super early first-hand statements from the witnesses themselves that come really close to, right after they have their experience, basically. We have the testimony of others who are at the Whitmer home when the 3 witnesses experience happens, at the Smith home when the 8 witnesses experience happens, who say, like, yeah, they came right in from the house and talked about the experience, right? Which is what they say should have happened with the first vision. We've got people around the town of Palmyra saying they're hearing about, they in the wake of these things happening, right? You've got rumors going around Palmyra that confirm they're talking about having seen the plates and stuff like that. Everything they say we should have for the first vision, we've got for the 3 and the 8 witnesses. And it's clearly not good enough to convince them of anything, right? And so we know when they say that, well, we discount the first vision because the earliest account is from 1832 and that's late. Frankly, in most contexts, within 12 years of an event is actually a pretty early document.
Joseph didn't have a journal; he wasn't keeping records.
Well, and they were dirt poor. They were dirt poor. They did not just have like scrap paper for, they couldn't just go down to, I don't know what stores you've got in the UK, but they couldn't just go down to like a Walmart or whatever and buy like a 70-page college ruled notebook and a pen for pennies or whatever and be like, yeah, Joseph, write all about your experiences. They had paper, but they had to use it wisely. It was a precious resource for them. Anyway, so basically, I think the evidence we have is very good, really, for the evidence for the witnesses. And I don't know, we've already gone on for quite a bit, so we can maybe get into some of the questions you want to ask. I was going to read a few more statements from that are firsthand from the witnesses to just help people get a flavor of like, this is what the witnesses themselves said. This is how they characterize their experience, right?
I love
Martin Harris in a letter to Hannah Emerson in 1870, November 1870, he just says, I do say that the angel did show to me the plates containing the Book of Mormon. He writes her back a little later because she asks whether when he went to England, he goes on a mission to England for the Strangites, and she had heard that he had denied Mormonism, or he went there to bash Mormonism or whatever. And he says, I answer emphatically, no, I did not. No man ever heard me in any way deny the truth of the Book of Mormon, the administration of the angel that showed me the plates, nor the organization of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints under the administration of Joseph Smith Jr. And that's an important caveat because people had certainly heard him criticize the organization of the church under the administration of Brigham Young. But no one had ever heard him be critical, he says, of the organization of the church under the administration of Joseph Smith. David Whitmer, my testimony to the world is written concerning the Book of Mormon. And these statements, most of David Whitmer's statements, they're boring because he just says stuff like, yeah, my testimony to the world is written, and the same that I gave at the first is the same that I shall stand to my latest hour in life, linger with me in death, and shine his gospel truth beyond the limits of life. So he's basically saying, yeah, what's written in that statement, that's true. And he does that over and over again.
He
I've
got
got
asked so many times about it, so
yeah,
he kind of got annoyed. So he had like a rote response ready for people.
yeah, I've got 2 or 3 other examples of him doing that. It's we don't need to go through them, but it speaks to, again, everything I was saying earlier. Like, look, that original document, that original statement, it deserves to be taken seriously because you've got participants like David Whitmer. You really want to argue because David Whitmer's signature is not on the statement, he didn't believe it. He told us in letters that do in fact have his signature on them, but mind you, that yes, what's written in that statement is true. And he did it over and over and over again. 1885, he tells E.C. Brand, I did see the angel of God. I was commanded to testify of these things, and they are true. I did see the angel. This is to Robert Nelson. I did see the angel as it is recorded in my testimony in the Book of Mormon. The book is true. One of my favorite ones is to a Sister Gates. It's just, I don't know. I find it very endearing, very touching. I don't know. You asked me if I saw the angel when he brought the plates. I saw the angel when he brought the plates. And the angel told us that we must bear testimony to the world as contained in my testimony written in the Book of Mormon. Doubt not, sister, the Book of Mormon is the word of God. Those are the kinds of things when they were given the opportunity, when they were asked straight up, hey, what do you believe about this? And they were actually given the opportunity to speak for themselves. This is how they talked about that experience. There's no waffling. There's no, well, we kind of thought we saw this or that, or it was just in our mind's eye or our spiritual eye. Like, that is not their language of choice in the primary firsthand documents that has survived. And I think that's important to understand. And that really, like, you have to know that, you have to look at that, you have to let that set the tone for the conversation about them and their experience, right? And how you're going to deal with and handle other sources that say other things, but are less directly coming from the witnesses themselves.
I've got one more here I found from Martin Harrison interview with John E. Godfrey, which really reiterates their official testimony. He says, after praying some time, the angel appeared with the golden plates. I saw with these 2 eyes the angel stand with the gold plates in his hands, and I saw him turn leaf by leaf the plates of gold. And I also heard the voice of the Lord saying that these words were true and translated correctly. And there's so many other statements from Martin where he will say to people, like, when people ask him, like, did you really see the angel in the plates? And he says, like, do you see the sun in the sky? Or do you see my hand? Or do you see that chopping block? And he'll often say, like, as sure as you see that, I saw the angel in the plate. So there's so many of his primary statements or some interviews where he's very emphatic that he knows he saw and what he heard as well. And the other witnesses, they're very adamant and emphatic. They reiterate. And I think, like, most critics will acknowledge that, okay, the witnesses seem to be credible in the sense that they're not part of a conspiracy. None of them, no real serious critic will say that they're part of a conspiracy, as all of them at one point leave the church, but they never deny their testimonies, even though Martin, Oliver return, David never does. So then they try to maybe focus on maybe a few statements, second or third hand, that might call into question, okay, did they really see it? Or they'll just argue for, well, it could have just been a hallucination, even if the majority of their statements seem to support that they really believe they saw and heard. They can still argue for, well, it could have been a hallucination.
Yeah, and I'd actually like to just, maybe before we get into some of the specific statements you'd like to talk about, I find it really instructive to contrast those statements we just talked about from all of the 3 witnesses. Really, we went over several here. The kinds of spiritual eyes statements from other visionaries of the time that people like Dan Vogel like to use as a point of comparison to say this is what spiritual sight is or whatever. Just listen to this language, and these are all examples that Dan Vogel uses to talk about spiritual sight. So I'm not like going out and finding my own that make my case. These are the ones that Dan Vogel likes to use. Emanuel Swedenborg. What I saw on that earth was not seen with the eyes of my body, but with the eyes of my spirit. Okay, this is firsthand from Emanuel Swedenborg. This is the way he talks about his visionary experiences. Oh, I didn't see them with the eyes of my body. I just saw them with the eyes of my spirit. Nathan Cole. It seemed as if I really saw the gate of heaven by an eye of faith. as plain as I ever saw anything with my bodily eyes in my life. Okay. It seemed like I really saw. This is these are like these like kind of waffly sort of things like that you don't get from the three witnesses when you let them speak for themselves. They don't say this kind of stuff. Charles Giles, I thought that I saw the glorious angel passed before the eye of my mind. Again, well, I thought I saw an angel. These are the way visionaries of the time talked about their experiences. And this is just clearly not how the witnesses themselves talk to their experiences. Like the contrast between their firsthand direct statements describing what they saw and these kind of statements from other visionaries of the time is night and day. They are emphatic, right? I did see the angel. I do say that I saw the angel, right? It was a clear, open, beautiful day, and at the time we saw the record laid before us by an angel, right? Like this is it's clear, it's direct, it's concise, it's powerful statements. They do not mince words. They do not hem and haw and waffle about it. That's not their language of choice. That's not the kind of experience that's not how they fundamentally understood the experience.
Right.
So,
gotcha. So maybe we could dive into some of the statements that critics would point to, and I don't know if there's a certain order you would like to go in that either refer to, spiritual eyes or eye of faith. I would like to acknowledge that I know in the book of Moses talks about seeing God with his spiritual eyes, and the eye of faith, I believe, is in Doctrine and Covenants 17. So that's also scriptural language that doesn't necessarily mean they didn't really experience it, but sort of scriptural visionary language as well.
So and I think we've got to understand that language. Well, there's a few things I think we have to just maybe preface the discussion on that sort of stuff, right? I made a big deal about the kind of language we actually see in the firsthand sources. We have to understand that all of the spiritual sight sources, many are late. Not all, but many of them are late, coming several years, sometimes several decades after the experience. There are some that are early. I'm not saying that they're all late, but many of them are late. All of them are secondhand at best. In many cases, they're more removed than secondhand. That sometimes they've been treated as secondhand when they shouldn't have been, because they were clearly third hand or even just passing on rumor, and gossip from around town. There's some sources that are just clearly like they don't know what Martin is actually saying. They're reporting what they're hearing around Palmyra, right? And that's it. And they're all from skeptics. Every single one of them is coming from people who don't want to believe what Martin's saying. They're just not going to. It wouldn't have made a difference how he articulated or expressed himself. They weren't going to believe it. They were looking for a reason to dismiss what he said. And this is important because not because it raises questions. I mean, it does raise questions about just how reliable they are, but there's enough sources that say he saw with spiritual sight that I do think he may have used that language on some occasions.
Yeah,
but all of this is important to understand, that the context, the way these statements are being contextualized and presented to us are outside of Martin Harris's control or David Whitmer's control or anybody else's. They are under the control of people who do not believe it and want to make it look unbelievable, right? And so they're controlling how, who knows how elaborate the actual conversation and discussion they had with Martin Harris was. They're reducing it down to this like short statement, and they're contextualizing it the way they want to, that makes it seem like really uncredible and unbelievable. And that's something we have to keep in mind when we're dealing with all of these sources, right?
Can I jump in with an example, Neal, to exactly that point?
Yeah, absolutely.
Maybe one we could tackle, because to my knowledge, this is the only source, although correct me if I'm wrong, Neal, it's the only source that quotes Martin as Martin Harris is saying he saw the plates, quote, with the eye of faith. That specific language, the only source is from John Clark. right?
Mhm.
The spiritualized thing, that's in a number of different accounts, but the quote "eye of faith" thing is from John Clark. So let's take a look at John Clark's account real quick, and let's put it on our critical thinking caps and see if we can determine anything about it. Okay, so here's John Clark. To know how, so he reproduces the testimony of the three witnesses in his book, published in 1842. And he says, to know how much this testimony, referring to the three witnesses statement he just republished, is worth, I will state one fact. Okay, lay it on us, John. A gentleman in Palmyra, bred to the law, a professor of religion, and of undoubted veracity, told me that on one occasion he appealed to Martin Harris and asked him directly, did you see those plates? Harris replied, he did. Did you see the plates and the engravings on them with your bodily eyes? Harris replied, yes, I saw them with my eyes. They were shown unto me by the power of God and not of man. That's almost a verbatim quote from the statement, right?
Right.
And then this is the guy again. But did you see them with your natural, your bodily eyes, just as you see this pencil case in my hand? Now say yes or no to this. Harris replied, why, I did not see them as I do that pencil case, yet I saw them with the eye of faith. I saw them just as distinctly as I see anything around me, though at the time they were covered over with a cloth. Okay, so let's take 1 second here. This is, at best, third hand from an anonymous source, because it's John Clark saying that he heard it from, quote, a gentleman in Palmyra who heard it from Martin Harris. Who's this gentleman in Palmyra that he's talking to? Do we know anything about this guy? Well, we know he's a lawyer, he's a professor of religion, so it's the kind of guy that's going to be naturally inclined to accept Martin Harris's statement, of course, right? So first of all, who's this guy that Martin is talking to? That's what I want to know. Is it a neighbor? Is it his cousin? Is it a friend? Is it some rando? How do we know? Do we know what this guy's, was he hostile? Was he genuinely interested? Was he trying to trick Martin Harris? We don't know anything about this guy. We just know that John A. Clark says that this guy told him that Martin Harris told him this. So right off bat, that's the first thing. Now, I'm not automatically saying we just chuck this source. What I'm saying is, to Neal's point,
automatically dismiss, but if it's third hand, yeah, it's more
right off the bat, you have two layers of people remembering and interpreting and contextualizing what they thought Martin told them, or what they perceived as Martin telling them. And then the way that John Clark, he ends up by saying, therefore it never happened. It was all fake. It was all hallucinatory or something, right? But that's not what Martin says. Martin doesn't say, oh, I was just in my brain and it was crazy. He says, I did not see it the way I see an ordinary mundane object lying around. Well, of course not, because he said it was shown by the power of God, by this angel. But he does say, I was in the body, they were my bodily eyes. Now, what about this thing? They were covered over with a cloth.
That's what I was wondering about, because that would seem to conflict with their official testimony of seeing the angel in the plates and all of their other statements of the angels showed them the plates, because they were covered in a cloth whenever he was the scribe for the Book of Mormon.
And that's exactly where I think this is one of the problems with these third-hand or hearsay accounts, is I believe at times they are conflating things that Martin was telling people. Because there are indeed times when the plates are covered and Martin is able to see them covered or handle them covered or whatever in the tablecloth. But when we have two layers of interpretation or passing the statement along, I think that absolutely introduces the likelihood that this guy that John Clark is talking to conflates or confuses the experiences that Martin was explaining to him, right? So I don't know if Neal wants to add anything to that. By the way, I would just also mention, to get it out of the way, because I know somebody in the comments on this video is going to jump in and say it, this is also the same John Clark that says, oh, Martin Harris said he talked to Jesus as a deer, right? That's even more problematic.
That's also just a story from a gentleman in Palmyra.
Yeah, he says right here, no matter where he went, he saw visions and supernatural appearances all around him. He told a gentleman in Palmyra after one of his excursions to Pennsylvania, while the translation of the Book of Mormon was going on, that on the way he met the Lord Jesus Christ, who walked along by the side of him in the shape of a deer for 2 or 3 miles, talking with him as familiarly as one man talks with another, right? Great. So we have a third-hand anonymous hearsay rumor that this happened to Martin. And there's no other source for this. There's no way to confirm that this actually happened. And John A. Clark doesn't even say that this gentleman told him, John A. Clark. He says Martin Harris told a gentleman. So how did John Clark learn about this? It's a rumor, in other words, right? So you get my point here. When we do encounter these statements that seem to throw some question about the firsthand official accounts given by the witnesses, as to Neal's point, we need to take a step back and realize that in no other, and I'll get to this as well as my discussion, in no other circumstance would we give preferential treatment to a third-hand hearsay report to a first-hand statement from the participant in the event, right? And I think precisely to this point, John Clark and others, as they're reporting the hearsay they're getting from sources, that leaves open the room for conflating or misunderstanding what Martin's reported experiences. Because yes, there are experiences where Martin and others handle the plates and the cloth and so forth, but that is not the same thing that happens with their official account. Anyways, Neal, anything you want to add to that, or do you think we've kind of hit the main point?
I mean, I think we've done pretty good. The only thing a couple points though is a lot of this little narrative that they tell, and like I said, look, I don't know about you, but conversations don't go like this, right? The way I talk about a conversation I had with someone might be rendered in a really pat narrative sort of way. Like I asked them this and they said this, and I asked but that's not usually how a real conversation, a real dialogue goes. And so again, there's context of what Martin said, what he was experiencing, what the gentleman said in part of the dialogue. A lot of context is missing here, and we only have this third-hand report. And the basic little dialogue here and narrative confirms a lot of what I'm saying. The way Martin chose, when he's first asked, he just says, yeah, I saw him, right? We don't get a quote, right? But it says he replied he did. So his preferred way, when he's asked about the plates, he just says he saw them. He asked, did you see them with your bodily eyes? He says yes, right? He says yes. I saw them with my eyes, right? They were shown to me by the power of God and not of man. And again, like Stephen pointed out, that's a verbatim, nearly verbatim quote. Well, that is a verbatim quote from the official statement. It's also verbatim from D&C 5, which isn't just a revelation about the three witnesses, but it was a revelation given specifically to Martin that basically says, after you see the plates, you are to tell people that you saw them by the power of God and not of man, and nothing else. He's told that's how you're supposed to testify. And we get years later in the Joel Tiffany interview, Joel Tiffany asks him about it, and he says, all I can say is that I saw them by the power of God. That is all I can say about it. And so Martin took pretty seriously this kind of obligation he felt from the Revelation, Doctrine and Covenants 5, to testify to seeing them and to testify to seeing them by the power of God. And he understood that to be something different than seeing an ordinary everyday object like a pencil case, right? Mm-hmm. Sure. But notice what he doesn't do when he said, when basically, look, this lawyer here is trying to entrap Martin. It's if there was a judge overseeing this interview, that the counsel for the witness could be, or the defense could object, right? He's trying to entrap Martin. Say no or yes to this. Does Martin say no or yes? No, he doesn't. He just explains, well, I didn't see it as I do a pencil case. It wasn't like seeing an ordinary everyday object, but I did see them with the eye of faith. And I think what's important to understand, and this is context that I cover in the paper I wrote for the Dan Peterson Festschrift and in the presentation I gave for FAIR. In 1829, no one who believed you could actually see angels, let's make that caveat there. Obviously, there are people who are skeptical of whether you could see angels in 1829, just as there are people who are skeptical of that today. But no one who actually believed you could see angels believed that you could just see an angel the way you see an ordinary object, right?
Without any faith, without there being any spiritual component.
Exactly. It's just not something anybody believed. And I go into pretty good detail on this in my other presentation and in my paper about the theological background to this in the 19th century. But basically, actually, some of the evidence comes from Ireland. You might be interested to know, but or maybe it was Scotland. Scottish preachers or Irish preachers.
Yeah, they're all the same.
Yeah,
Close enough.
But in the 18th and 19th century, there's all this evidence of the clergy basically clamping down on the idea that you could actually have visionary experiences with your physical senses. Mm-hmm. And they were basically saying the only way to validly see divine things is by spiritual sight, by the eye of faith. And a big reason they believed that is because they believed that God and angels and all of these things are totally immaterial, right?
Right,
They
right.
believe in this immaterial God who doesn't have a physical form to see in the first place. And his angels are immaterial, and they don't have a physical form to be seen. And this is theology that develops through late antiquity and the Middle Ages, and kind of culminates in this period here, and obviously persists today in a lot of Christian denominations. There is no physical form of divine things and beings to see, and so if you see one, it has to be with the eye of faith. It has to be with the inner eye, the spiritual eye, whatever. And you have to, and in fact, you've got Thomas Aquinas saying, even what's seen by the eye of the mind when you see God or when you see an angel is just a metaphor. And of course, that's the only viable conclusion to come to. If you believe God has no form, then the form you're seeing isn't really him anyway, even if it is just spiritual sight. So there was this kind of this vocabulary that had grown up, and we quoted from some of these other visionaries. Other visionaries play to it exactly as they're supposed to in the way they talk about their experience. Well, I thought I saw with the eye of the mind or with the eye of faith, or I didn't really see with the bodily eye. That's not what Martin Harris says when he's confronted with this. He doesn't say, I didn't see with the eye of my body. When he's asked if he saw with bodily eyes, he says, yes, I saw them with my eyes, right? The Restoration has a completely different theology, right? And it's not just like post-Restoration theology that develops with Joseph Smith. Martin Harris tells us in an 1870 account that before he joined the church, he had already concluded that the God of the creeds, without body, part, and passions, was false. He says, I couldn't fear that God. I couldn't wrestle with him. I couldn't challenge him to a duel, right? And he's making an allusion to Genesis 32, which is one of the most anthropomorphic accounts of God in the entire Hebrew Bible, where Jacob wrestles a man who turns out to be God himself. And then so Jacob says, after he's done wrestling with the man and he gets a new name, Israel, he names the place Peniel, saying, I saw the face of God, which is the Hebrew for Peniel, right? I saw the face of God and lived, and he's stunned that he's alive. And this is what Martin believes, right? We have accounts of Martin Harris basically saying he was afraid to look into the interpreters because he couldn't resist the urge to wish to see God. And he believed that the interpreters could show him anything he wanted to see. And he was afraid that if he looked into the interpreters, wished to see God, it would show him God and he would die. That's what Martin believed. And some people might think that sounds crazy, but it's totally in line with the Old Testament. God has a human bodily form, but he can't be seen. So Martin rejects this immaterialist idea that sets up and juxtaposes spiritual vision and sight and seeing from physical, tangible experience. And because he rejects that, we can't interpret any statement attributed to him about eye of faith or spiritual eyes or whatever as having that same dichotomy that would have held for like an evangelical visionary at the time who really did believe that they weren't really seeing the things they saw in vision or whatever, right? That's not what Martin believes. And that's not what he's trying to convey or express when he says things like, yeah, I saw him with spiritual eyes or whatever.
Right, interesting. Yeah, and I think it's just a questionable source, this John A. Clarke one, it being third hand. And particularly, I think that it appears to me seems to be some sort of a conflation when it talks about him seeing with the eye of faith, but the plates being covered with a cloth, because that is not what the testimony of the three witnesses claim or experience. So what I thought
And
could
it's
be
not what Martin will say in other accounts, by the way. Like, let's be clear about that, right? We have accounts from Martin and the other witnesses that say they saw them uncovered. So you have this one third-hand account. Well, I don't know if it's the only one, but it's a third-hand account. It's one that skeptics put a lot of weight on that says it was uncovered. But once again, we have plenty of sources say they were not uncovered. That's what leads me to conclude that our informant must have been conflating this longer conversation that Martin was having, because he had multiple experiences, multiple encounters with the plate, some covered and then the one uncovered in June of 1829.
Yeah, and even if Martin used the language, let's just say, for safe argument, let's just say he did in like all of his retellings say spiritualized, which he doesn't, this still would be going against his testimony, claiming to see it but the plates were shown to him by an angel. So this one is strange because he's saying covered in a cloth.
Right.
Yeah. Well, and I think Stephen's right. That like when he's saying I saw them just as distinctly as I see anything around me, though at the time they were covered over with a cloth. They are conflating something he said in the course of either this conversation, or since it's third hand, it may have even been a separate conversation that's getting
Yeah, who's
conflated
to say? We have no way of knowing.
But when he's asking, did you see him like you see an ordinary object in a pencil case? Well, when Martin saw them covered, he did see them like an ordinary object. And those are not testimonies to take lightly either, because Martin, we have accounts of him talking about handling them in the box and while covered with a cloth. He told, was it David Dill? Is that his name? He tells him that he had a conversation with Joseph Smith for an hour or something in the woods while the plates sat on his knee covered, and he turned them over leaf by leaf. And so this is not like there was an object that was obscured by a cloth and he saw it and he assumed it was the plates. No, when he saw and handled the covered plates, he was able to investigate them well enough to know they were metal plates. They were bound by rings. He had leaves that he could turn over and feel, right? And so
I've got the source right here, Neal. It's to David B. Dill, September 15, 1853, published in the Millennial Star. He says, I then addressed Mr. Harris relative to his once high and exalted station in the church and his then fallen and afflicted condition. I afterwards put the following question to Mr. Harris, to which he severely replied with the greatest cheerfulness. What do you think of the Book of Mormon? Is it a divine record? Mr. Harris replied and said, I was the right-hand man of Joseph Smith, and I know that he was a prophet of God. I know the Book of Mormon is true. Then smiting his fist on the table, he said, and you know that I know it is true. I know that the plates have been translated by the gift and power of God, for his voice declared it unto us. Therefore I know of a surety that the work is true. For, continued Mr. Harris, did I not at one time hold the plates on my knee an hour and a half whilst in conversation with Joseph when he went to bury them in the woods, that the enemy might not obtain them? Yes, I did. And as many of the plates as Joseph Smith translated, I handled with my hands, plate after plate. Then describing their dimensions, he pointed with one of the fingers on his left hand to the back of his right hand and said, I should think they were so long, or about 8 inches, and about so thick, or about 4 inches, and each of the plates was thicker than the thickest tin.
So yeah, this is like, so when he talks about seeing them as distinctly as anything around me, but they were covered, again, this isn't like a vague, like I saw a lumpy object or whatever covered and I assumed they were the plates. This is a tactile physical examination that he probably felt in this context he could relate to. Well, yeah, I did actually see them like a pencil case under these circumstances, but it's not just a casual, like he's examining them as thoroughly as he can while covered, and he's very confident about what they are. In fact, he goes, at some point, we can't chronologically place all these experiences, but I suspect that happened shortly around the time that D&C 5 was received. And he goes after that and he testifies in court. They wanted him to testify that there was a trial in Lyons, New York. They were trying to get Joseph for scamming. Basically, Lucy Harris wanted to like throw Joseph in jail for scamming her husband, but Martin himself gets up and testifies that no, Joseph has the record. And I know he does. And so he was confident about what he was seeing and handling, and those experiences were as ordinary as seeing a pencil case, right? But yeah, when he sees an angel, it's a different kind of experience. It's not just like, walking into a printing office or whatever the context is here, and seeing a pencil case sitting on the desk, right?
Right. So I wanted to touch on the Stephen Burnett statement. I know you're going to do a deep dive on the 8 witnesses, but he talks a little bit about the 3 witnesses, and similar to this quote from John A. Clark about like seeing Martin Harris seeing the plates but covered in a cloth. So I just wanted to read the snippet and then get your take on it, because I could see why a critic might think, oh, well, some of this might support that statement from John A. Clark. So this first part says, So this was written from Stephen Burnett to, was it Lyman Johnson, 1838?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So he says, when I came to hear Martin Harris state in public that he never saw the plates with his natural eyes, only in vision or imagination, neither Oliver nor David. And then jumping down, he later says, Martin Harris said he had hefted the plates repeatedly in a box with only a tablecloth or a handkerchief over them, but he never saw them, only as he saw a city through a mountain. So kind of like the two criticisms of the three witnesses is he's saying that Martin, and also what Martin said of Oliver and David, is that they didn't see with their natural eyes, only in vision. And then he also adds imagination, which one I don't believe Martin would have said that, but I could believe him saying using vision to describe their experience. But
Yeah.
I think this is Burnett, then he's interpreting that as, oh, well, he just imagined it. But then later when he talks about Martin hefting it repeatedly in a box with a tablecloth over it, and he only saw the plates as he saw a city through a mountain. I'm curious, how do you interpret that experience? Do you think Burnett is interpreting that Martin only saw the plates in a visionary experience, but with the plates covered with a cloth? Or do you think he's saying, okay, his experience as one of the three witnesses when they saw the angel in the plates, that was just visionary or imagination, but when did you actually see the plates naturally? And he's saying here, when Martin was scribe, oh, okay, they were just covered in a cloth. And again, him seeing it like a city through a mountain. What do you make of that? Do you think Martin like made that sort of comment? What's your thoughts on that?
So I think this is the same thing as with the Clark source, like Stephen said, is you've got Stephen Burnett. Man, there's a lot of Stevens in this discussion.
There's too many. We have Stephen the Great.
Too many.
I'll just be called the Murph. Avoid confusion.
You've got Burnett conflating things that Martin said, and I think it's really important to keep in mind. This is actually the probably the best source for the spiritual sight stuff, because it's actually pretty early, and it also comes not only is it early in terms of like it's not that long after the original three witnesses experience, it's less than a decade, but it's also like within weeks of when these meetings are supposed to happen. So, right. Credit where credit's due. This is a solid source in terms of how early it is.
I guess it's secondhand of what Martin.
But it is secondhand.
Third hand for the aid, I guess, but for Martin, right, I guess you'd say it's secondhand and contemporary.
Yeah, it is secondhand for obviously Martin's own experience, and you could argue there's maybe a little bit of a gray area. It's firsthand in terms of what Burnett says he heard, but in terms of like pinning down what Martin actually said, right? This is secondhand. And you've got this guy who Martin is on record, because Burnett tells us that Martin feels like Burnett is misunderstanding him. So we literally have the person who's misunderstanding Martin in the first place being the only one who's reporting what's being said. Well, maybe not the only one. You do have you have a shorter account of this from Warren Parrish, who is also a skeptic, who's in league with Burnett. And then you have
made that argument to me about Warren Parrish, that you have two people who are both sort of like supporting each other. That is he accurately recording what Martin said?
Well, but it's confirming both of their biases. They both
exactly.
It's confirming both of their biases, and they're both looking for a reason to dismiss what Martin's saying. But Martin is telling us, Stephen, you want to talk about an admission against your own interests, which is how Vogel views this from Martin Harris. But it's not. It's in the interest of Stephen Burnett to report it this way. What goes against Burnett's interest is admitting here that Martin gets up and basically says, "You're misunderstanding me."
And right? Martin's upset about it, and he says, "I feel very sorry for any man that would fight against the Book of Mormon." And Burnett, we'll see it because we'll read I don't know if we'll read the whole letter, but I have the letter here we can go through. It causes a division among the Kirtland dissenters. The question of what do we do with the Book of Mormon is still something that the Kirtland dissenters cannot agree on. And this is something that George A. Smith reported on. Burnett mentions it. Other people mention it, that the fact that Martin is disenfranchised with Joseph Smith's leadership in Kirtland, but is still affirming the Book of Mormon as divine and authentic, that's what's causing this scandal. And exactly to Neal's point, both Warren Parrish and Stephen Burnett fall on the side of we jettison all of it. We jettison all of Joseph Smith's claims to prophetic inspiration and revelation, and that includes the Book of Mormon. And so, yes, as Neal said, it's within their interest to report it this way. And to be fair to them, because I don't think they're like maliciously lying or anything like that, I think that this is how they are interpreting, and this is how they are internalizing what they hear Martin Harris saying. And then they turn around and based on their interpretation of what they heard Martin say, they report it in this way, which makes it seem fantastical or unbelievable because that's what they believe. And this is a natural thing that humans do. Again, I'm not trying to dogpile on these guys, but just to say, as soon as you are passing through the filter of second or third hand, this automatically becomes a problem because you have to count on the person conveying the account that they accurately, properly understood what the person was saying and what they intended with what they said, let alone accurately recounting what they actually literally said, right? And so it compounds these problems. And so when Vogel says, well, but Warren Parrish said the same thing, yes, but he's in the same camp as Stephen Burnett on this. So we have the same problem with Warren Parrish as a reporter of what Martin is supposed to have said in this March meeting in the temple.
And there are some serious red flags here that I think, if I'm remembering correctly, and I do want to caveat that, I'm not trying to misconstrue Vogel or anybody here, but I think Vogel grants these details, as I recall correctly, but there are some red flags here. You mentioned imagination is probably not something Martin has said.
And he says
later,
only a lot in that statement as well.
Yeah,
Stephen Burnett,
and later he says they saw in vision with eyes shut. These are actually phrases that show up earlier in a Kirtland Apostates account from what's his name? Ezra Booth. These are things that show up in these letters from Ezra Booth that get published a few years before this. And it's Ezra Booth's language. Nobody thinks, he reads, Ezra Booth hears the three witnesses testifying. And again, he confirms the way they're testifying is that they really saw the plates. But then he reads D&C 17 and he interprets the expression power of God by faith through the power of God, or whatever the exact language is in D&C 17. I can't remember. He interprets that to mean they only saw in imagination. Okay. Now notice that's not the language of the revelation. That's not the language that any of the witnesses are using. That is Booth's language. That's how he interprets what that means.
Right.
And so he says in imagination, and he talks about visions being had with eyes shut. And Burnett is picking up on that language and he's filtering it into his account of this conversation with Martin or what Martin said. And Richard Lloyd Anderson pointed that out. And I think, like I said, as I recall correctly, I think Vogel agrees that's not Martin Harris's language.
Yes.
That is language that Burnett is picking up from Booth. Okay. And so again, these are red flags about there's an interpretive layer here that is being added by Burnett that is meant to make the experience seem less credible. Did Martin describe it as a vision? Sure, absolutely. Again, going all the way back to their original statement, there's no denying that they're describing it as a vision that is had by the power of God. But did he say only in vision? Again, like you said, there's a lot of these onlys in there, and there's a lot of ifs in there. If they only saw it in vision with eyes shut, then no one can be brought to prove, and this is a key part here, is Burnett's articulating this theory that you can't prove there are any real plates because nobody really saw them. And that is why I think Martin brings up how he saw and hefted the plates. Again, the context is being filtered through Burnett, so we don't have it. He's conflating things. But the full context of the conversation is Martin is getting up. He's saying, no, you are misunderstanding me. There were really plates and I saw them. And he's realizing, look, they're super skeptical of this vision thing. So he's trying to explain to them, no, they were real. I saw that when they were covered. I saw them. I hefted them. I felt them. There is a real tangible object here. You cannot say that there is no real plates. They were definitely real. And he's trying to help them understand that. He's trying to convince them by talking about his physical experience with the plates along with his vision. And, Burnett is just, he's not having it, basically, right? He's not willing to accept it. And I don't know where this expression "city through a mountain" comes from. It doesn't show up in any other document related to Martin Harris.
Right.
Yeah, I was going to ask that question. Like, is
I've
there any other
never
statements we have?
examined. I've never thought to look if is that an expression that's common in the 19th
Mhm.
century or something. But I do know Richard Lloyd Anderson suggested that what Martin is saying here, the like a city through a mountain, is the context when the plates are covered and he's hefting them and he's not seeing them directly, and so he has to kind of imagine them like you might. I guess maybe you're headed somewhere, like she's coming around the mountain when she comes, kind of thing, and you can envision, there's a city on the other side of the mountain because maybe you've been there before or whatever, and so you can envision it as you're traveling there. I don't know, but he kind of suggested this expression of only saw them as a city through a mountain is related to when he's handling them covered, because they're covered, so he doesn't see them directly, right?
So I've got a question. So when Martin Harris is saying that, down here, which we think it could likely either be a conflation, or do you see it as possible that before he had his experience as one of the three witnesses seeing the angel in the plates, is it possible that he might have also remembered an experience when he was holding and hefting the plates covered in a cloth, and he might have thought he had like an eye of faith experience that's not the same, that's different than his experience of one of the three witnesses, that he's saying that I saw them through the eye of faith when they're covered in a cloth? Could this be another situation
Like
of time, or do we think this is just Stephen Burnett conflating what Martin is saying?
So if I understand what you're saying, like he's got the plates, they're covered and they're hefted, and he maybe like has like a visionary experience at that time
At
or
that
something.
time, but it's not the same as the one he had with the three witnesses.
I mean, I don't know. I wouldn't read the evidence that way. I think that's maybe a little tenuous. We don't have anything that would really convince me of something like that. I really
There's
think
nowhere
that,
else other than that where he talks about having that experience.
I mean, I think that I think that really, like I said, and like we've talked about both with Burnett and Clark, what they're doing is they're conflating different things Martin said in a way that's advantageous to their point of view, right? And Martin, when you try to kind of decode that, what I sense from Martin in these sources is he's talking to hostile skeptics who just don't want to accept, right, that he saw the plates. And again, you saw this with like the Clark one, where his initial answers to the questions are, yes, I saw them. Did you see them with your bodily eyes? Yes, I saw the plates. He's maybe a little exacerbated with these kind of hostile investigators, these hostile inquirers, who are, like I said, they're not going to accept it if he says he saw him with his bodily eyes. They're not going to accept anything he says, but he's trying to, like, his own personal experience is basically under attack, right? Imagine if we questioned the narrative of some online ex-Mormon, right? They'd be talking about their personal lived experience and how that's sacrosanct and we shouldn't dare question it, right? But that's what's happening, right? Martin's saying he saw the plates and his lived experience is being questioned and challenged, and he feels that hostility. And he's trying, in the context of these really skeptical inquirers, he's trying to give them something that he thinks they'll take seriously and as credible. And he's saying, no, look, you don't buy the vision thing? Well, I handled and hefted them. They were a physical object. They were as real as anything I'd ever saw. Right? That's what he's doing. And that's the context for these statements, I think. And again, they're being filtered through these skeptics who don't want to give any credence to it, and they're conflating things in ways that are advantageous to them.
Right. So there's an interview by Anthony Metcalfe with Martin Harris. I have on here 1873, 1874, and I won't read the full quote, but critics would point to this quote that Martin supposedly says, "I never saw the golden plates, only in a visionary or entranced state." Again, we talk about vision is probably likely language that might have been used. And then again, "I passed into a state of entrancement, and in that state, I saw the angel and the plate." So critics would say, okay, it was a vision or he was in some sort of a trance. So it wasn't this natural viewing of the plates. This would support it being spiritualized or in their mind, or perhaps it being some sort of a hallucination. What's your thoughts on this statement? And then I believe David Whitmer writes a letter to Anthony Metcalfe. So if you have that handy.
Yeah. In fact, look, let's do that, because look, my answer is the same as what it was to all those other ones. Martin's understanding of it, like, yeah, it's a visionary experience, but he doesn't have this dichotomy between physical experience, bodily experience, and visionary experience. And David Whitmer answers this, right? Because Metcalfe doesn't write about this until Martin Harris is dead. So Martin Harris has
1888 is when he publishes it.
Martin Harris has no opportunity to clarify, but he writes to David Whitmer telling him, hey, this is what Martin said. And David Whitmer, firsthand witness to what really happened, right? He responds, in regards to my testimony, the visitation of the angel, who declared to us three witnesses that the Book of Mormon is true, I have this to say. Of course, we were in the spirit when we had the view, for no man can behold the face of an angel except in a spiritual view. And this speaks to what we talked about already, that this is what people believed in the 19th century. If they believed you could see an angel, they only believed you could do it with some kind of spiritual, way, except in a spiritual view. But we were in the body also, and everything was as natural to us as it is at any time, right? And this is, to me, this I use this in my Martin Harris paper because it confirms everything I'm saying about what the witnesses actually believed about spiritual sight versus the way people want to use it and handle it for polemical purposes, really, right? People aren't using these statements to try and understand David Whitmer or Martin Harris. They're using them for polemical purposes to discount and discredit them. But when we actually look at what one of the witnesses himself says in a firsthand statement in responding specifically to this criticism, I mean, you couldn't ask for something better. You have this criticism. Well, here's one of the witnesses responding to it, describing his own experience. He says, look, we were also in the body, and everything was as natural to us as at any time. And we have sources, they're secondhand because they come from Nathan Tanner. But Nathan Tanner talked to David Whitmer and heard a very same thing. He said, David Whitmer said, I have been asked if we saw those things with our natural eyes. Of course they were our natural eyes. There is no doubt that our eyes were prepared for the sight, but they were our natural eyes nevertheless. So again, you have all these accounts. You just have a fundamentally different worldview undergirding the language the witnesses are using here from both their contemporary critics and especially from their modern critics today, who want to insist that these sorts of experiences mean that they didn't really see anything at all with their physical or their natural eyes. And notice that this statement from David Whitmer flat out contradicts what Burnett's saying when Burnett tries to say they did not see with natural eyes, only in vision, right? Burnett sets up this dichotomy between visionary spiritual sight and natural eyes. And David Whitmer rejects that dichotomy. He says there is no dichotomy between those. It's a spiritual view, but it's also a natural view.
I like what you said about his natural eyes having to be prepared for it as well. And I think I had a quote where he talks about like being overshadowed by like the power of God and a halo of brightness, indescribable. And I don't think Martin in any of his other statements does he talk about it being a trance or him falling into trance, but certainly vision. So again, is that similar to Burnett, who adds or imagination, where Anthony Metcalfe is adding or entrancement?
Yeah, what's the common denominator between these guys, between Anthony Metcalfe, between Stephen Burnett, and Warren Parrish and these people, even Pomeroy Tucker, who describes this, John Gilbert, who describes this. One of the common threads that links them together is that they sort of together reject this supernatural realm, okay? Or they reject the potential or the possibility for supernatural encounters in a real meaningful sense. So Anthony Metcalfe's the whole punchline to his little book that he publishes is how he ends up as an atheist, basically, right? He calls himself an infidel, and how his lifelong took him to this position of like basically all religion and superstition or supernatural is fake, right? So what I see happening here is when Harris, exactly what Neal's saying, when Harris reports, I had a vision of this, or he uses I have faith language or spiritualized language, they then interpret that to mean, because they believe that visions aren't real, that visions are fake, therefore that must mean that what happened to Martin was fake, or it was just in his brain and he was crazy, right? And so they are layering on top of that. So trance, that's the kind of good word that an atheist would use to describe a crazy religious person having a visionary experience, right? Oh, they were in a trance, or they were enchanted somehow, right? It was an illusion in some sense, right? So we keep encountering this problem where they are, I think, describing more or less, fairly accurately or decently accurately what Harris is telling them. But in each case, they are overlaying that with their interpretive paraphrase or assumption of what that must therefore mean. And as Neal pointed out, and Metcalfe does this too, it's for the purposes of reinforcing their own metaphysical beliefs about why, quote unquote, Mormonism is dumb and fake and why you shouldn't believe it, right? Or why Joseph Smith's visions were fake. So you keep encountering the same problem. So when Metcalfe says he was in a trance, he says, he quotes Martin as saying, I was in a state of entrancement. Let's assume that Martin did say that. Did Martin mean the same thing that Anthony Metcalfe may have thought he meant when he said I was in entrancement? Right? How do we know? We can't tell. So you latch onto these key words, or skeptics latch onto these key words, while ignoring, and this is why I think it's brilliant what Neal has done with this new article, ignoring the broader lexical usage of this language by these people, both in their broader lives and beliefs, but also in broader 19th century sort of discourse, right? Or sort of lexical usage of these terms. Because we today hear the words imagination and trance and spiritualize, and in our world where the spiritual is decoupled from the physical in so many ways, we immediately jump to this therefore means hallucination or made up or imagination, right? Imagination itself today is sort of it's fanciful, it's make-believe, right? It's just in your brain. That's it, right? So yeah, not to harp on the point, but yes, I think you're right.
Certainly not what the witnesses believed of their experience. Whether or not you want to say, well, I still think it was a hallucination because I don't believe in the supernatural, or I don't believe the Book of Mormon is historical. As you look at their statements collectively in the majority of their primary and secondhand, they're very adamant that it wasn't a hallucination or something in their mind, that it was real to them. I think it's important to take these accounts into account for Martin Harris about, spiritualizing what these people say, but then there's so many other statements where he's very emphatic about, which we read at the beginning, about seeing with his eyes, hearing with his ears, knowing what he saw, like, as sure as you see my hand, I saw the plates. So in other cases, he's really adamant that he really did see it,
I think that's exactly right. Whatever you individually want to believe about this, that's fine. If these statements don't convince you because you're a stone cold atheist who just rejects a priori the existence of a supernatural realm or a spiritual realm, okay, that's fine. You can do that. But you can't pretend that that is a reasoned, principled argument based on the historical sources for why you reject that, right?
Yeah.
You can't pretend that I'm rejecting it because Martin Harris's testimony is incredible. No, you reject it because you're an atheist. Fine, there's nothing we can do about that. That's an individual assumption about and worldview about metaphysics or whatever. But yes, you can't pretend like these statements give you that sort of position to take, especially when you pick them out of isolation, as is most often done.
Yeah, because it's funny, the episode I did responding to the Mormon Stories episode, where we address some of those quotes and I give my responses to it. But then whenever I read at the end the 60 or 70 statements, and there's probably way more, but those are the ones that I accumulated into the video, and it would have been way too much to read through any more than that. A lot of people commented after, because it was really quite obvious and quite clear that if you look at the majority of their statements, they're very adamant about their testimonies, what they experienced. It was real to them. It wasn't a dream or juggling, trickery, a hallucination to them. And then people started to say, like, well, even if they, are adamant that they saw the angel in the place, that doesn't mean they did. But then the point I was making is it's important to represent their testimonies accurately and fairly and to be transparent, and not just focus on a small minority of statements, especially if they're second or third hand, and misrepresent or omit all of their other statements. I think the most intellectually honest or consistent position to come to is, I don't believe in the supernatural, or I don't believe the Book of Mormon is historical. Therefore, even if they are absolutely certain that they believe that they saw the angel of the plates, I believe it was a hallucination.
Yeah, and I've seen some people online start to say this as well. Their efforts to diminish the evidentiary weight of the witnesses' statements is to say exactly what you said. I predict this is going to be the line going forward. I predict this is going to become the new sort of party line from skeptical Exmos or others, right? Is just to say, well, okay, fine. Yes, they did believe this, but that just says what they believed. It doesn't say anything about actual external reality, which, okay,
Yeah,
again,
I had a lot of
again,
people saying that because they realized that focusing on these few sources are not very credible in light of all of the others.
right.
And that was
Sure.
something whenever I was out of the church, I'd only heard these statements and I'd interpreted the official testimony of the three witnesses in light of these statements and was completely oblivious and unaware of all of the other statements. And it's important to look at them collectively in totality. If you're about truth and transparency, you want to look at all the data you can, and especially their first and second hand statements.
Yeah,
Right.
and so my big deal here, and the whole purpose of my paper that I wrote, is to make the point that you cannot claim that Martin Harris or any of the other witnesses are admitting that their experience was purely visionary, purely internal, purely subjective. And that's language that shows up in Dan Vogel's writings, specifically in other people's, it's the way it's interpreted all over the place online and stuff like that. They hear spiritual eyes, eye of faith, and they say, he's admitting that he didn't really see it, not with his natural eyes. And my whole point, you can still disagree because, like Stephen said, you're not going to accept a visionary experience on metaphysical grounds or whatever the case may be. If you don't think he really saw them, fine, but you cannot claim that he admitted to only having an internal experience and not really seeing plates, right? That is not what that language meant to Martin Harris. That is not what that language would have meant to David Whitmer. And we have David Whitmer telling us that's not what that language meant to him, right? So you can't claim that they're admitting that. You have to accept that they really believed, they really saw with their real eyes an angel, the plates, all the other artifacts that they mentioned seeing in that vision. And you've got to come to terms with that. And maybe you just think all three of them are nutso crazy. Okay. I don't think that's very tenable based on the totality of evidence we have on all of those witnesses and their lives and their statements and the things that they did and believed. And I actually think Martin gets the most flack for being nutso crazy. And I actually think we have the best evidence that he was actually quite cautious and skeptical about all of this. Out of all of the witnesses, David Whitmer and Oliver Cowdery jump in head over heels a lot faster than Martin did.
Because Martin interviewed each of the Smiths, didn't he, to see if their stories lined up, and he said well, it's either lead or gold, but Joseph didn't have enough money to buy.
I mean, Martin does several things to kind of try to investigate what's really going on here. He's curious, he's interested, but he shows some degree of skepticism and attempts to even taking the characters to to Anthon and Sam Mitchell and all of those guys can be seen in the context of, okay, you won't let me see the plates. Well, show me some of the characters and let me have those authenticated. Let me have those investigated. There's Martin's doing lots of things to try and exhibiting caution, if not full-blown skepticism, right? But he's exhibiting caution and he's trying to do his due diligence, if you will. And I just don't think you can honestly say that these are dupes who got tricked, right? But if that's what you want to believe, fine. But don't go around the internet saying they only saw them with spiritual eyes and they admitted that it wasn't really, they never really saw the plates. That's not even remotely what the body of historical evidence tells us. Right.
So there's two more points I want to discuss before we maybe finish this part one on three witnesses. Then we'll take maybe a little break and do part two on the 8 witnesses. So I want to talk about the John Murphy interview, and then I want to just bring up one last argument that critics might make. So it's an 1880 interview with John Murphy. Now, you can never trust a person with the last name Murphy. He's probably a drunk Irishman on Guinness. But this one was kind of strange.
I'm sure the reason you want to talk about this is because it's a Murphy.
Oh, of course, yeah, that too. That's why it stood out to me. So it's an interview with David Whitmer. Now, I think as I've read through a lot of their statements, they don't go into too much detail about the description of the angel, like his appearance or those sorts of things. Compared to Joseph in his 1838 account of the angel Moroni visiting him. But in this account, so he asked Whitmer about like the appearance of the angel, and he says like it had no appearance or shape. Murphy then says, "Then you saw nothing nor heard nothing." Whitmer says, "Nothing in the way you understand it." Murphy then says, "How then could you have borne testimony that you saw and heard an angel?" Whitmer says, "Have you never had impressions?" Murphy then says, "Then you had impressions as a Quaker when the spirit moves, or as a good Methodist in giving a happy experience, a feeling." And Whitmer says, "Just so." And then he goes on to say that, well, I think he should recant. His testimony doesn't sound very credible. So I think that the 2 points someone might take from this is, oh, well, Whitmer's saying like he didn't really, if he did see the angel, he didn't really have any appearance or shape. Was it just an impression? And was this just sort of a, a similar sort of subjective spiritual experience that, a common Methodist or someone might have, like he didn't really see the angel? And this does seem like a bit of an anomaly or a strange one, but what's your take in this interview?
Well, yeah, it is an anomaly in the entire body of data, and it's a strange one, and it's one that we have explicitly being denounced by David Whitmer himself. Right? He hears about this. There's an old BYU film on this. I think you can find it on that YouTube channel, Old Mormon Videos, or whatever the name of that YouTube channel is. He actually he drafts a statement and goes around town getting signatures from prominent men, and then he asks the what was it, the Richmond what paper was it?
Oh, I know what you're talking about. I want to say the Courier, but I don't think that's right. Hold on.
He asks some newspaper, the Richmond something or other, to publish his statement, right? That where he basically says John Murphy is an untrustworthy drunk Irishman. Not not really. He doesn't say that, but he does say he actually starts it out. He's like, a proclamation unto all nations, kindred tongues, and people unto whom these presents shall come. It having been represented. I have the text of it in front of me, but I just don't have the source, so I don't know the Richmond what, but
Probably Telegraph or something.
yeah,
Yeah.
something. But it having been represented by one John Murphy of Polo, Caldwell County, Missouri, that I, in a conversation with him last summer, denied my testimony as one of the 3 witnesses of the Book of Mormon, to the end thereof, therefore, that he may understand me now if he did not then, and that the world may know the truth. I wish now, standing as it were in the very sunset of life, and in the fear of God once for all, to make this public statement, that I have never at any time denied that testimony, or any part thereof, which has so long since been published, that the book, with that book, as one of the 3 witnesses. Those who know me best well know that I have always adhered to that testimony, that no man may be misled or doubt my present views in regard to the same. I do again affirm the truth of all my statements as then made and published. He that hath ear to hear, let him hear. It was no delusion. What is written, and he that readeth it, let him understand. Right? And so he is, he's basically saying John Murphy misunderstood me. The experience happened as written, right? We already talked about several of his other statements where he just tells people like, yeah, the testimony written is true, right? He misunderstood me as it's written, and it was no delusion. And he affirms all my statements, right? So everything he said about it. Well, does he have statements that contradict this idea that it was just this vague impression and that he didn't really see a form? Yes, we do. We have him saying, no, I saw an angel. I saw the plates, right? We have actually some very elaborate descriptions, maybe not of the angel himself. There are some I think there are a few accounts that talk about how far off the ground the angel stood, and things like that. But
Probably dressed in white. I'm sure I've read a couple.
Dressed in white, yeah. But we have he gives us these elaborate descriptions in some of his newspaper interviews about seeing the angel, and then a table there where the plates were on, and the plates were on this table, and the other artifacts are there. Like, he very clearly in all of his statements, he's describing more than just having an impression, right? And so some people have been like, well, but that statement doesn't actually deny explicitly what John Murphy said about him just having a vague impression. It's like, no, he said, I affirm the truth of all my statements as then made and published. Okay. He's saying everything I've said about this and that's been published about this is true. And in those published statements, starting with the official statement, he's described seeing an angel, seeing the plates, seeing a table, seeing other artifacts. He's given an interview where he bangs the side of the bed and says it was all as real as this bedpost, right? He's saying this is what all of these things that I've said over the years are true. It's no delusion. What's written is written, right? And those things do. His published testimony, his published record contradicts what John Murphy's saying. And he's standing on that record, basically, is what he's doing.
Right. Very good.
Yeah, I think in Whitmer's mind, the way that Murphy represents the interview is tantamount as to saying that Whitmer has denied or has discarded his previous statements, which is why he feels obliged to come out with the subsequent statement in saying that the impression or the representation of the interview that Murphy gives, which, I mean, to be fair, it kind of does, right? Because we go from an angel appearing in glory and speaking and so forth, a voice coming down, to, well, I had some impressions and there was nothing of shape there, right? So I think that's what, because yeah, Vogel makes a big deal about the fact that, like, well, but hold on, Murphy doesn't actually say that Whitmer denied his testimony. Well, no, not in those words, but like in the representation that Murphy seems to have given to David's experience. That's what David and others seem to have interpreted as trying to get people to think that he had denied his experience.
It's
he comes out and makes the statement.
It's clearly what John Murphy thinks happened, because he's saying, well, he should recant his testimony because this is not what he said, right? He clearly, his takeaway was that he had basically said his testimony wasn't true.
And it appears he felt misrepresented.
Now, might David have said that, like, might he have mentioned that they had like spiritual impressions or powerful spiritual impressions during the experience? Like, sure. I would like to think I have spiritual impressions over way less than seeing an angel. I don't know about you guys, but I experience spiritual, expressions, spiritual sensations, feelings, whatever you want to call them. I experience those with way less than seeing an angel, way less than seeing a really sacred object like the plates. So might he have mentioned that, like, yeah, we had some spiritual impressions during the process? Sure, maybe. Might he have said something to the effect of, like, well, we didn't see like you or I see under ordinary circumstances, because we've already seen and we've already talked about some of the evidence that, like, yeah, they understood that seeing an angel entailed some kind of something different. It's a visionary experience. And so again, we have this guy, John Murphy, maybe taking some of the things David Whitmer said and then arranging them in a way and presenting them in a way that makes it sound like he's outright denying actually seeing an angel, actually seeing the plates, actually seeing the table, and again, everything else that he's described ever seeing in various interviews, which at least some of have already come out and been published before this point. What year is this? 1881?
1880.
Yeah. So
1880 is when the interview happens, and 81 is when Whitmer makes the statement that responds to it.
And so, and he's had interviews in the Chicago Times and stuff like that since 1875, at least, as early as then. So he's saying, look, I've described seeing all kinds of things here, and I'm not denying that I saw those things. It wasn't just vague impressions, right? So I think there's, and again, we don't know what John Murphy's motive is, but he clearly doesn't take the idea that David could have actually seen an angel very seriously, right? So we can extend the benefit of the doubt and the idea that, like, maybe he was in fact representing the conversation as he understood it, but his own skepticism is filtering how that's being remembered and represented and retold.
Take away from this one, don't trust a guy with the last name Murphy to do an interview. That's why I record mine, because if I just transcribed it, it would be so inaccurate and I would just make up so many things. So the last sort of point or argument, I think, the most intellectually honest and best argument for someone to make against the three witnesses is to say, number one, either, I don't believe there's a God, I don't believe in the supernatural, so therefore it had to have been then some sort of hallucinatory mystic experience, or I don't believe the Book of Mormon is historical. And we've had conversations about evidence for the Book of Mormon and criticisms going against. But if you were to come to the conclusion, I don't believe the Book of Mormon is historical, then therefore it must have been some sort of a hallucination. I think probably the next best argument that they might make is one to say, okay, even if the three witnesses are very consistent, very adamant that they know they saw the angel in the plates, they had this visionary mindset, this magical worldview, believing in like Oliver Cowdery, in dowsing rods or in seer stones, and it was a more visionary culture, and that they were believers in the work in the Book of Mormon, and perhaps they were spiritually primed to then have this hallucination or vision, and perhaps maybe Joseph had this ability to hypnotize or induce visions in people, and really they're not that credible because they had this magical worldview or visionary mindset. Even if they had a decent enough character, upheld in their community, were honest, sincere, they still could have had this hallucination. And this is incredible evidence for the Book of Mormon. What's your response to that argument?
I'll just say off the hand, I could understand an atheist employing that argument. I kind of have to chuckle when I see, especially like evangelical Christian critics of the Book of Mormon employ this argument as well, which they're wont to do. Joseph Smith and his buddies were steeped in the occult and in magical stuff. And like, my dudes, have you read the Bible? Right? Like the magical worldview of first century Roman Judea that the apostles were steeped in. So
well, it's exactly the argument that atheists make against
precisely.
the resurrection,
yeah.
right?
Oh, well,
Yeah.
there were, you read, is it Richard Price and the Jesus mythicist guys, or not Richard Price? That's the anti-polygamy guy.
Richard
Anyways,
Carrier.
Thank you. Richard Carrier and these guys write, oh, well, there were all sorts of magical legends of dying gods and people coming back to life and so forth. And the Bible's magical. Yeah. So right off the bat, I would say, if you want to play that argument, I sure hope that you don't believe the Bible, because that's a pretty good way to sort of shoot yourself in the foot. The second thing I would mention,
Dan Vogel, one thing I did appreciate with him is he said that his theory or critiques, he would apply the same to the witnesses of Christ's resurrection, which I appreciate, because you're being intellectually at least consistent then.
Well, and it's funny because I've seen these interviews or these sort of debates where sort of an atheist or an agnostic like Bart Ehrman has a debate with an evangelical Christian apologist over the resurrection. And this is precisely what these guys say. So you're big on the witnesses for the resurrection. What about the Book of Mormon witnesses? And the response is always, it's actually very disappointing when I see guys like William Lane Craig, who is otherwise a pretty smart, bright dude, be like, oh, well, they just, admitted they made it up, or they just recanted, or they just lied. I'm like, oh my gosh. So yes, credit to where credit is due to Vogel and others who are consistent that way. I suppose, well, this is getting into sort of a bigger conversation that we can't really have here. But the first question I always ask people when they accuse Joseph Smith and others, or describe Joseph Smith and others as having, quote, a magic worldview, the first question I say is, define magic. What does that mean, to have a magic worldview? Because according to contemporary atheists, I have a magic worldview just by virtue of the fact that I believe in God. So that means that, therefore, I have a magical worldview, that therefore nothing that I describe should therefore be sort of taken with any kind of credibility, because I have this magical worldview that I'm steeped in, right?
And so they might respond with saying, like, maybe like certain items having objects magical power, say seer stones, divining rods, treasure buried.
Well, how about oil? How about the fact that as a priesthood holder, I put oil on people's heads and I give them priesthood blessings? Is that a magical action that I engage in? And therefore, whenever I bear testimony to an experience I may have had, that my testimony should automatically be met with skepticism? Like, that's my first kind of problem with this, is getting into the fact that, like, these terms, quote, magical worldview, are thrown out there without people actually, like, seriously unpacking, what do we mean by this? Just having a belief in divine, or if you want to say supernatural powers. I basically think that magical is a disparaging sort of pejorative term. I've been, my academic studies of studying ancient religion and stuff like that, both the ancient Egyptians and ancient Semitic peoples, and discussing the Mormon context of this, I basically have been radicalized that nobody has a good definition of what magic is. and nobody has a good, like, grounded principled definition of, quote, magic or magical worldview. It basically amounts to either something I think is fake and made up, or something that I think is otherworldly and spooky and I don't like it. That's what, quote, magical worldview basically means for like 99% of people that use the term. So I've tried to just sort of retire that term altogether in my own usage. And so again, I just have to ask my initial response, and I'll let Neal get some of his thoughts in here. I just have to first ask people, what do you mean by that? Because just because a person believes that they have seer stones and divining rods, that does not, I believe, automatically call into question, or should call into question, when they describe experiences, including shared experiences. Because the question of, can you have shared hallucinations simultaneously? I mean, it opens up all of that, right?
Audiovisual.
Yes, audiovisual and so forth, that independently you can describe unrelated from each other and so forth. So it gets on. So that's kind
Which
of
is
my
quite
initial.
amazing that that's promised or prophesied, in the Book of Mormon and in Joseph's revelation. If he is a fraud, the Book of Mormon isn't what it claims to be, that he would promise or prophesy they'd have this mass visionary experience, and then to pull that off, and then for them to never deny it or even like question it, even when they leave the church, to say like, oh, was it maybe a bit of a hallucination? Did he do some sort of hypnosis on us? But they never question,
Right.
even when they could have, when they were out of the church. It's quite an amazing thing to have pulled off.
Exactly. Neal, what do you think? Do you have any
Well,
thoughts?
I think, speaking to Stephen's point about magic worldview just basically being religious, I remember reading at one point someone trying to make the case, it's really easy to pull out these statements that make Martin Harris look kooky. It's a lot harder to do, actually, with David Whitmer, and it's even harder to do. You have the divining rod stuff with Oliver Cowdery, but like actual statements from Oliver Cowdery that make him look kind of like a religious kook aren't really, there's not really a lot of them. So I remember reading someone who was trying to make that case, and they're basically just like quoting this like run-of-the-mill religious language from Oliver Cowdery in his letters back and forth to Joseph Smith during the printing process. And it's just like, okay, like this just sounds like a religious guy. Like, and they're making the case that he's like this, he's a crazy zealot religious guy who's prone to have visions because of this language. And it's like, no, he's just a religious person, period. And all that tells me is that the person who's I was reading on that occasion would think I'm a crazy nut job too. And that's okay. You're probably going to get people in the comments who are going to talk about how me and Stephen are crazy nut jobs. So, whatever. There's actually this debate between Braden Clark and E.L. Kelly, or Edwin Kelly, the RLDS apostle, in the 1880s, and they call all these witnesses from Kirtland about Martin Harris and stuff, and Braden Clark will ask them these questions, and they'll be, oh yeah, Martin was crazy and visionary and all this stuff, and then E.L. Kelly will get up and he'll cross-examine them, and he'll be like, do you say he's crazy and visionary because he had a bunch of other visions, or just because he said he saw the gold plates? And they're like, well, the only thing I ever heard him say is that he saw the gold plates and the angel. And so it's like, oh, well, okay. So by virtue of just claiming to have seen the plates in the first place, you're just officially writing this person off as a visionary who's prone to visions, who's crazy, right? That's basically what's happening in these testimonies, and it happens over and over again in these cross examinations that Kelly does with Braden Clark. Unfortunately, we don't get to cross examine the Palmyra people who first kind of put it in the idea that Martin is this crazy kooky person. No one ever cross examined them and questioned them about the wild stories they're telling about Martin. But we don't see a lot of those kinds of stories circulating in Kirtland, where Martin lives most of his life. Why is that? That's kind of sus, don't you think? That's getting me off on a tangent. As far as Joseph Smith being able to like induce a vision or something, I like to point to March 1829, a few months before, when Martin comes down, and this is the context for Doctrine and Covenants 5, when Martin comes down and he says, I need a more sure witness. That's what, or I need a greater witness. That's what Isaac Hales remembers Martin saying. Is he says, right, I need a greater witness. And the reason he needs a greater witness is because he was just up in Palmyra, and his wife and a bunch of other citizens said, we're going to take Joseph and Joseph Sr. to court for defrauding people with this claim about the gold plates. And if you don't testify with them, we're going to throw you in jail with them. We've got enough evidence. We're going to do it. And so he comes down and he says, Joseph, I've got to see those plates. I've got to know. I've got to know what you really have. And this is why I think at least some of the occasions where Martin hefted and handled the plates covered is in context of this experience. But this is where D&C 5 comes from, where we first get this promise that there's going to be 3 witnesses. And what's really interesting is in the original manuscript, in the current published edition of the Doctrine and Covenants, it says that there's some phrase about how eventually there will be these 3 witnesses or something. But there's nothing in the original manuscript that indicates that they would have to wait for this experience. Okay. So there's a lot of pressure here. Martin really wants to see the plates. There's a lot that feels like it's on the line. If he can't convince Martin to believe, why not induce the vision here? Right? If Joseph can just get people to have visions and see whatever he wants them to see, and you can say, well, you've got to have all this pressure and you've got to have all these right circumstances. The circumstances are right. Martin is primed to see this. He wants to believe. There's a lot of pressure on him to defend Joseph. I can't see any compelling reason. If Joseph Smith is capable of inducing a vision, he's already given the revelation that allows him and that grants him to do it. And I think there's some evidence in the Isaac Hale count that they did try to have Martin see the plates at that time. They go through this thing where Joseph goes and hides the plates in the woods, and then he lets Martin try to follow his footprints in the snow. And if he can follow the footprints to where the plates are and find them, they're gonna interpret that like, okay, Joseph, I didn't break my, I didn't violate my thing. I didn't directly show them to him. And if the Lord will let you see them this way, you'll see them. Why go through all of that? If you can just induce a vision on Martin, and if Martin's this crazy guy who's prone to see visions, right? Why not induce a vision here and let's just get it out of the way right there. Martin has a vision. He sees the plates. He can go and he's going to be convinced and everything's going to be great. But that doesn't happen. And instead they end up with like, he doesn't see the plates and he's got to be, reassured in other ways that Joseph really has the record. There's no, there's no plausible reason for there not to be a vision here if that's something Joseph is capable of. But Joseph can't. He doesn't just induce a vision. He's not capable of it. And I also, and I actually, maybe this could be how we segue into the 8 witnesses. The 8 witnesses obviously complicate this because, as I mentioned before, I think the 8 witnesses stand as pretty compelling evidence that Joseph has a believable set of ancient plates. So you don't need to even induce visions. He never promised visions in D&C 5 or D&C 17. He's got a set of plates that he can show people. So the vision appears to be totally outside of Joseph's control, as far as I can tell. And Mary Whitmer is a witness to that, right? She's actually seeing the plates completely out of Joseph Smith's control. So I don't think that there's any really, like, that just doesn't land for me, this idea that Joseph somehow induced some kind of hallucination to these people who are prone to see visions. I mean...
And there's one quote I like to read. This is probably one of my favorite quotes. It's when David Whitmer's been interviewed. I think it's by Drew Smith III in 1884. And I believe there's a Colonel Giles in the room. And he asks David Whitmer if it's possible that he'd been mistaken or simply been moved upon by some mental disturbance or hallucination, which had deceived them into thinking he saw the personage, the angel, the plates, the Ermenthon, sort of Laban, which is a good question. Like, that's sort of like what a lot of people are wondering today. And David's response is, or this is what Drew Smith III says, "How well and distinctly I remember the manner in which Elder Whitmer arose and drew himself up to his full height, a little over 6 feet, and said, in solemn and impressive tones, 'No, sir, I was not under any hallucination, nor was I deceived. I saw with these eyes and heard with these ears. I know whereof I speak.'" Which is just super emphatic. Like, he's saying that he knows it wasn't mental disturbance or a hallucination. He saw with his eyes, heard with his ears. But as you were saying, like, you could maybe say, okay, the 3 witnesses, it's possible they could have had some sort of a hallucination if we just had those. But the 8 witnesses are also combined support there being like this actual, like, tangible artifact plates, which I think we're going to maybe dive to maybe in a part 2. and you're going to take the lead on that one. Again, addressing Stephen Burnett and some of his claims against the 8 witnesses and others, because the main critical argument is that they didn't really see the plates. They were covered in a cloth, and that because they really would support there being tangible plates, and the combination of the 2 sets of witnesses is good corroborating evidence for the gold plates being, ancient and divine and being authentic. But I think this has been a really great dive into the 3 witnesses, and I really appreciate both of you sharing your expertise and your research. Is there any final thoughts you want to give in this segment before we close?
No, I think we've hit all the major highlights.
Yeah,
Neal especially. Big hand to Neal for sort of taking the lion's share of it.
Yeah, no, great deep dive, and I'll put the link in for your article as well whenever it comes out. But thanks so much, guys, and thanks everyone for watching. If you've enjoyed this, give it a like, share it with other people, and comment underneath your thoughts as well in this video. Don't forget to subscribe, and definitely come back for part 2 when we do a deep dive into the 8 witnesses and the Stephen Burnett ladder, and we'll also just do some rapid fire on the witnesses as well. Thanks everyone for watching. Take care. Bye-bye. Thanks everyone for watching this episode. If you've enjoyed it, please give it a like, share it with others who might benefit, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any future content. You can also listen to these episodes on podcast form on Anchor or Spotify, and you can follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Check out my website for more content, personal blog, and more. And if you care to donate to support me, you can via my PayPal or Patreon, or through the website. And you can also give donations via YouTube through Super Chats. Thanks for watching Mormonism with the Murph. Take care. Bye-bye.